The hidden history of the Salazar family, the Valley of Wolves. There are places in this world where the earth remembers, not in the metaphorical sense, not in the way historians speak of sites bearing witness to tragedy, but in a literal, physical way. The stone holds memory. The soil carries imprints of what walked upon it centuries ago. And in the mountainous region of Spain known as Valdelobos, the Valley of Wolves, the very ground pulses with a history so dark that the Spanish crown tried to erase it, tried to bury it beneath Catholic doctrine and noble bloodlines, tried to seal it away where no one would ever disturb it again. They failed. The story of the Salazar family cannot be told without first understanding what they were tasked to guard. Before there were Salazars, before there were counts and castellans and Catholic crusades, there was an older civilization in Valdelobos. Archaeological evidence suggests a technologically advanced society built vast underground cities in the region's natural cave systems. These weren't primitive dwellings carved from rock. These were architectural achievements, structures with purpose and planning, suggesting a culture that understood engineering principles, lost to the dark ages that followed. What happened to these people remains uncertain. Did they die out naturally? Were they conquered? Did something in those caves consume them from within? The historical record goes silent, but what they left behind was worse than any monument or artifact. Las Plagas. The parasites existed long before humanity gave them a name. Fossilized remains suggest they're prehistoric organisms, predating human civilization in the region by potentially thousands of years. At the cellular level, Las Plagas developed a survival mechanism that borders on the miraculous. When environmental conditions become hostile, the parasite doesn't die. It reduces itself to a spore state, dormant but viable, capable of remaining inert for centuries until conditions improve. And when inhaled by a host, when those microscopic spores enter warm, moist lung tissue, they regenerate. Over months or years, they rebuild themselves cell by cell until a fully formed parasite takes root in the host's nervous system. At that point, the organism isn't just alive, it's in control. The ancient civilization beneath Valdelobos discovered this. Whether through accident or intention, they learned that Las Plagas could be cultivated, that the parasites would bond with human hosts and grant the ability to influence, command, and control entire populations. One dominant plaga could direct hundreds of subordinate organisms. A prophet carrying the supreme parasite could rule an empire of the infected without dissent, without rebellion, without the messy unpredictability of human free will. By the medieval period, survivors or descendants of this lost culture had formed Los Iluminados, the enlightened ones. The name suggests spiritual awakening, divine revelation, a path to higher consciousness. The reality was darker. Los Iluminados worshiped Las Plagas as holy creatures, viewing parasitization not as infection but as sacrament. To surrender your body to the organism was to achieve communion with the divine. To resist was heresy. The cult's practices were extreme even by medieval standards, which is saying something given the era's tolerance for public executions and religious fervor. Cave paintings found on a nearby island depict ritual sacrifices, victims held down while their hearts are removed, all performed beneath the Los Iluminados insignia deliberately designed to resemble a mature plaga. The cult didn't just kill, they converted. Unwilling subjects were implanted with parasites, their resistance meaningless once the organism took root and their minds became extensions of the prophet's will. For generations, Los Iluminados existed openly in Valdelobos, the isolated mountain community, cut off from the rest of Spain by geography and cultural differences. maintained its own traditions, while the Iberian kingdoms unified under Ferdinand and Isabella, while the Reconquista pushed Islamic rule from the peninsula and the Inquisition targeted Jews and Muslims, Valdolobos remained apart. The cult operated freely, performing their rituals, expanding their numbers, securing their power through supernatural means. The region's economy centered on farming and mining. Valdolobos was known for mineral deposits, particularly an indigo crystal the locals called velvet blue. But beneath the commercial ventures, beneath the surface activities that might have seemed normal to any passing traveler, Los Iluminados controlled the population through plaga infection. Those who resisted were sacrificed. Those who complied lived as extensions of the prophet's consciousness. This couldn't last forever. Spain was changing. The Catholic monarchs were consolidating power, enforcing religious uniformity, eliminating anything that deviated from approved doctrine. A pagan cult performing human sacrifices and trafficking in mind control through parasitic organisms was exactly the kind of heresy the Inquisition existed to destroy. The Spanish crown issued orders. Los Iluminados and the demons they consorted with were to be eradicated. A military force was assembled and sent into the mountains with clear instructions. Cleanse Valdolobos of this corruption or don't return. Leading that force was a nobleman named Gregorio Salazar. The First Crusade, Gregorio the Conqueror. The year was 1741. Gregorio Salazar rode into Valdolobos with his men behind him, and the authority of church and crown at his back. What he found in that mountain valley wasn't just a heretical cult. It was a society structured entirely around parasitic infection, where free will had been systematically eliminated and replaced with the prophet's singular consciousness distributed across hundreds of bodies. The historical record from this period is sparse. Official documents describe Gregorio's campaign in broad strokes. Heretics were suppressed, demons were sealed, the region was pacified, but fragments of information survive in family chronicles and local folklore, enough to piece together what actually happened in those mountain passes. Gregorio's forces encountered resistance immediately. The infected fought with coordination that shouldn't have been possible for untrained villagers. They moved as one organism because, in a very real sense, they were. The prophet controlling them could direct every infected person simultaneously, creating tactical advantages that conventional medieval warfare wasn't prepared to counter. But Gregorio had numbers and training. His soldiers were professional fighters, not farmers with farming implements. More importantly, he understood that killing the host wouldn't destroy the parasite. Las Plagas could potentially survive, even if removed from the body, could lie dormant and wait for the next opportunity. Complete eradication required finding where the organisms were concentrated and eliminating them permanently. The cult members were hunted systematically. Some were formed into lines and executed by sword. Others were impaled on stakes and their bodies burned. Not mere cruelty, but practical necessity. Fire was one of the few methods guaranteed to destroy the parasites completely. The executions were public, brutal demonstrations that the old order was finished. Survivors fled to a nearby island, taking what they could carry. Gregorio pursued them to the shore but didn't follow across the water. Whether he believed the threat contained or simply lacked the resources for an amphibious assault remains unclear. The island became a sanctuary for Los Iluminados remnants, a place where they could hide and preserve their traditions in secret while the mainland was purged. The real challenge was dealing with the parasite source. Gregorio's forces located the ancient underground city, the vast cavern complex where Las Plagas had been cultivated for generations. The main hive lay beneath what would become Salazar Castle, a a concentration of organisms numbering in the thousands, perhaps tens of thousands, preserved in amber and hanging in clusters throughout the cave system. Gregorio couldn't destroy them all. The caverns were too extensive, the parasites too deeply embedded in the geology. Instead, he sealed the complex. Stone walls were erected, passages were collapsed. The entrance was buried and secured with mechanisms designed to prevent accidental discovery. The parasites within were presumed dead. After all, how could they survive without hosts after so many years? This assumption would prove catastrophic 3 centuries later, but Gregorio couldn't have known that. From his perspective, the threat was contained. The cult was scattered. The region was cleansed. For his service, Gregorio was rewarded with the title of Count and granted sovereignty over the territory he'd just conquered. Salazar Castle was constructed directly above the sealed caverns, a fortress designed to guard what lay beneath. The position of Castellan, castle governor, was more than ceremonial nobility. It was a sacred duty passed down through bloodlines, a responsibility that superseded even the count's title. The first Count Gregorio took his charge seriously. He transformed Valdalobos from a cult stronghold into a Catholic community. The infected were dead or exiled. The survivors were converted, sometimes willingly, often under duress. A church was built in the village center, replacing Los Iluminados' gathering places with Catholic architecture. Gregorio and his descendants would protect these people, would maintain vigilance against any resurgence of the old religion, would ensure that Las Plagas remained sealed and forgotten. The people of Valdalobos celebrated him. Folk songs were composed about the conqueror, the nobleman who saved them from demons. His deeds were mythologized, transformed from brutal military campaign into heroic crusade. Children grew up hearing stories of how Gregorio defeated evil and brought light to the valley. But Gregorio understood what historians and storytellers would later forget. The parasites weren't destroyed, they were contained. And containment only works as long as someone remembers what they're containing and why it matters. When Gregorio died, his son inherited more than a title and a castle. He inherited a war that would never truly end. Guardians of darkness, the early generations, Hipólito the Sealer, second Count of Valdalobos. Hipólito Salazar grew up in his father's shadow. The conqueror's legend loomed over everything, set an impossible standard for heroism and duty. Hipólito was trained from childhood to understand the family's true purpose. He walked the sealed caverns with his father, studied the mechanisms designed to prevent access, learned the history of Las Plagas and Los Iluminados in detail that most nobles would consider unnecessary. His father's dying words were reportedly simple: watch the caves, always watch the caves. Hipólito took the instruction literally. He established regular patrols of the underground passages, checking seals and walls for any sign of compromise. For years nothing happened. The parasites remained dormant. The cult stayed hidden on their island sanctuary. Valdalobos prospered under Salazar protection, its dark past fading into folklore. Then the insects came. The family chronicle describes it as a plague of demons emerging from the depths of the earth. More specific accounts suggest a massive insect swarm rising from the sealed caverns. Not just a few specimens, but thousands upon thousands of arthropods pouring through breaches in the stone barriers. These weren't normal insects, they were larger than they should be, moved with unnatural coordination, and attacked with apparent purpose rather than instinct. Whether these were Las Plagas in their natural form, the parasites are arthropods after all, or some related organism cultivated by the ancient civilization remains unclear. What's certain is that Hipólito responded immediately. He assembled his garrison, descended into the caves, and engaged the swarm in darkness. The battle was chaos. Fighting insects in confined underground spaces with medieval weapons meant getting close enough for them to cover you, to crawl inside armor, to find every gap in your defenses. Hippolito's men were experienced soldiers, but this wasn't combat they'd trained for. You can't parry an insect. You can't intimidate a swarm. Hippolito personally led the effort to reseal the breach sections. While his men held the insects back, he directed the construction of new walls, the collapse of compromised tunnels, the reinforcement of existing barriers. The work took days. Men died. Hippolito himself sustained multiple injuries, bites, stings, wounds from falling stone as passages were deliberately collapsed. But the seal held. The swarm was contained. When Hippolito emerged from the caves covered in blood and insect remains, the threat was over. The injuries didn't heal properly. Infection set in, possibly from the insect attacks themselves, possibly from exposure to spores in the cave system. The family chronicle notes he died of disease, his body unable to recover from what he'd endured in the darkness. He was the first Salazar to die directly from his family's duty, paying with his life for keeping the parasites sealed. His son, another Gregorio, inherited a castle, a title, and a growing paranoia about what might emerge next time. Gregorio the architect, third Count of Valdolobos, the third Count. Gregorio is described in family records as being driven by irrational paranoia. That's the official version. But if you'd grown up hearing stories about your grandfather, the legendary hero, and your father who died fighting demon insects in underground caverns, you might develop some healthy paranoia yourself. Gregorio III didn't trust the existing defenses. His father had proven the seals could be breached. The next incursion might be worse, so he did what wealthy, paranoid nobles do. He spent the family fortune on security. The elaborate contraptions installed throughout Salazar Castle during his reign weren't decorative. They were defensive mechanisms designed to trap, delay, or eliminate intruders. Rotating bridges that could dump attackers into chasms, spiked ceilings that descended to crush anything beneath them, rooms that flooded or filled with smoke, labyrinthine passages designed to confuse and disorient, and the hedge maze, a seemingly decorative garden feature that actually served as an open-air kill zone where defenders could observe and eliminate threats from the castle walls. Modern visitors to the castle ruins note how many of these mechanisms seem designed less for human attackers and more for containing something trying to escape from below. Gregorio wasn't building defenses against invading armies. He was building contingencies in case the seals failed and Las Plagas emerged into the castle itself. The renovations cost a fortune. The Salazar family wealth, accumulated through mining operations and feudal taxation, was systematically drained into construction projects that must have seemed insane to anyone who didn't know what lurked beneath the foundation. Servants whispered that the Count had gone mad. Visiting nobles found his obsession with traps and mechanisms disturbing, but Gregorio understood something his critics didn't. The parasites were patient. They'd survived centuries in spore form already. If they could breach the seals once, they could do it again. Better to be labeled paranoid than to let the family's guard slip. When Gregorio III died, he left behind a castle transformed into a fortress labyrinth and a treasury depleted to near bankruptcy. His son inherited a strategic defensive position and a dire financial situation. Jose Alonso the Tranquil, fourth Count of Valdolobos, Jose Alonso Salazar, took a different approach. Where his father had been obsessive about physical security, Alonso focused on restoration and stability. The family's reputation had suffered under his father's increasingly erratic behavior. The treasury was empty. Relations with neighboring nobles and the Spanish crown were strained. If the Salazar family was going to survive another generation, it needed to rebuild its financial base and social standing. The historical record describes Alonso as working to restore the family's honor, though some sources suggest the goal was restoring the family fortune. Likely both were true. In feudal Europe, honor and wealth were intertwined. A respected noble house could command better marriage alliances, more favorable trade agreements, greater political influence. Alonso scaled back the elaborate construction projects. He focused on making the existing defenses functional rather than adding new ones. He reopened mining operations in the mountains, extracted velvet blue crystals and other minerals, sold them to merchants in Madrid and Barcelona. He negotiated favorable terms for Valdelobos's agricultural products. He attended court when summoned, fulfilled his obligations to the crown, presented himself as a reliable vassal. Critically, he maintained the watch on the sealed caverns. The patrols his grandfather instituted continued. The mechanisms his father built were maintained and tested regularly. Alonso understood that financial recovery couldn't come at the cost of vigilance. The duty remained paramount. Under his reign, Valdelobos stabilized. The region remained isolated by geography and culture, but integrated enough with broader Spanish society to avoid suspicion. The people prospered. The castle became known not for paranoid defenses, but for efficient administration. Alonso passed the improved situation to his son, who would squander it almost immediately. Alejandro the Lavish, fifth Count of Valdelobos. Alejandro Salazar had the misfortune of being born wealthy after his father had worked hard to rebuild the family fortune. He inherited financial stability, assumed it would last forever, and proceeded to spend lavishly on personal pleasures. The family chronicle describes him as playful at heart, which is charitable phrasing for irresponsible. Alejandro commissioned a grand courtyard and an opulent ballroom, architectural vanities that served no defensive purpose and cost enormous sums. He hosted elaborate parties, invited nobles from across Spain, transformed Salazar Castle from a remote mountain fortress into a social destination. This wasn't necessarily malicious. Alejandro probably believed he was elevating his family's status, demonstrating that the Salazars were cultured sophisticates rather than provincial mountain lords. The ballroom was genuinely impressive, featuring artwork and architecture that wouldn't be out of place in Madrid or Barcelona. But wealth spent on luxury is wealth not available for maintenance, for security, for the actual duties the family was meant to perform. The patrols in the caves continued, but were less frequent. The defensive mechanisms built by his grandfather received less maintenance. The focus shifted from guardianship to entertainment. Alejandro died young under circumstances the family records describe only as an untimely death, disease, accident, assassination. The specifics are lost. What's notable is that he died before the consequences of his negligence became apparent, leaving his widow to manage the aftermath. Decline and duty. The later years. Maria Isabel the Lady, 6th Countess of Valdelobos. Countess Maria Isabel Salazar is unique among the family line for actually receiving the title herself rather than through her husband or son. When Alejandro died, their potential heir was too young or non-existent, which meant Maria Isabel inherited the countess title directly and ruled in her own right. She would hold that title for longer than any other Salazar. The family chronicle notes she lived to age 90, maintaining control of the castle and region for decades. This longevity suggests competence. You don't survive that long in a position requiring constant vigilance unless you're exceptionally skilled at the job. Maria Isabel understood what her late husband had forgotten. The family's wealth existed to serve their duty, not the reverse. She curtailed the lavish spending, redirected resources back to security and maintenance. The ballroom her husband built remained, but it wasn't the focus anymore. The defensive mechanisms were repaired and updated. The cave patrols were increased and professionalized. She also had to manage the transition from medieval feudalism to early modern governance. The world was changing. Spain was becoming a more centralized state. The Spanish Inquisition was at its height, enforcing Catholic orthodoxy with brutal efficiency. Managing a remote mountain community that had once been a pagan cult stronghold required political skill and careful diplomacy. There's evidence Maria Isabel maintained extensive correspondence with church authorities, ensuring that Valdalobos remained in good standing with Catholic hierarchy. She funded the local church, supported the priest, made public displays of devotion. To outside observers, Valdalobos was a model Catholic community. Only the Castellan and her closest advisors knew what lay sealed beneath their feet. During her reign, there were no major incidents with Las Plagas. The seals held, the cult remained scattered. Valdalobos prospered in relative peace. When Maria Isabel finally died at 90, she'd successfully maintained her family's duty through nearly a human lifetime. Her son Diego inherited a secure position and clear instructions about what mattered. Diego the Severe, 7th Count of Valdalobos. Diego Salazar was described as exceedingly strict, which might be understatement. Accounts from servants suggest he was harsh, demanding, intolerant of any deviation from his expectations. Where his mother had been firm but fair, Diego was authoritarian. This severity extended to his personal life. When his wife Catalina bore him a son, Ramon, who almost immediately displayed signs of serious illness, Diego's response was cold. The child was weak, sickly, an embarrassment to the Salazar name. Where Catalina wanted to pursue every possible treatment, Diego saw the illness as proof of genetic weakness that shouldn't be indulged. The exact nature of Ramon's illness remains unclear in historical records. It's described as a strange disease, a terminal affliction that stunted his growth and left him weak. Modern analysis suggests it could have been any number of genetic disorders, autoimmune conditions, or congenital problems. What's certain is that Ramon wasn't expected to survive to adulthood. Diego's response was to largely ignore his son. He focused on his duties as Castellan, maintained the security protocols his mother had established, and apparently hoped the problem would resolve itself through the boy's death. This approach created a rift in the family. Catalina, desperate to save her child, began seeking alternative treatments against her husband's wishes. The servants later reported that a stranger appeared at the castle, someone they referred to only as the devil. This figure offered to cure Ramon's illness. Catalina, faced with watching her child die or accepting help from a source her husband forbade, made her choice. The stranger was Osmond Sadler, descendant of Adam Sadler, heir to the scattered remnants of Los Iluminados. Sadler had spent years researching bioweapons technology and plaga genetics. The cult's survival on their island sanctuary had allowed them to continue their practices in secret, to refine their understanding of the parasites, to develop new strains that could grant hosts greater autonomy while still maintaining control. Sadler offered Catalina exactly what she wanted, a cure for Ramon's illness. The price was implanting the boy with a dominant plaga parasite. Catalina accepted. Without Diego's knowledge, she allowed Sadler's people to inject a plaga egg into Ramon. The parasite would hatch, integrate with the boy's nervous system, and supposedly stabilize his deteriorating condition. He would retain his personality and higher brain functions, but would be susceptible to control by the prophet. The procedure worked. Ramon's health stabilized. He grew stronger, but something else was growing in him too, a cruelty that manifested in his adolescent years as sadism and violence. When Diego finally discovered what had been done, the confrontation was explosive. The family records note only that Diego was murdered at the hands of a devil. More detailed accounts from the remake suggest Diego confronted his son directly, called him a demon child, threatened to send him back to hell, proclaimed that Ramon should never have been born. Ramon killed his father, whether through plaga-enhanced strength, through planning, or through simple rage. The boy murdered the seventh count and assumed the title himself. Catalina disappeared shortly afterward. Some sources suggest she fled in horror at what she'd unleashed. Others hint that Ramon eliminated her too, removing the only witness who could explain how he'd gained his power. The truth is lost, but the result is clear. By his mid-teens, Ramon Salazar was orphaned, isolated, and in complete control of Salazar Castle. Everything his family had fought to prevent for centuries was about to be undone by their last living heir. The devil's bargain, Catalina's desperation. Understanding what happened to the Salazar family requires understanding Catalina's position. History tends to judge her harshly, the mother who invited evil into her home, who betrayed centuries of family duty, who enabled the destruction of everything her predecessors built. But that judgment ignores the impossible situation she faced. Picture it. You're married to a man described as exceedingly severe, a man who values duty and strength above compassion. You bear him a son, and that son is dying. Every day you watch him grow weaker. Doctors can't help. Medicine doesn't work. Your husband's response is cold dismissal. The boy is weak. Let nature take its course. We can have another heir. But you can't accept that. This is your child. You're watching him die by inches, and everyone tells you there's nothing to be done. Then someone appears offering hope. Yes, the method is unorthodox. Yes, your husband forbids it. Yes, there are risks, but the alternative is certain death. What do? Catalina made her choice. She invited Osmond Sadler into Salazar Castle, into the very fortress designed to keep Los Iluminados permanently excluded. She allowed cult members to treat her son with methods that directly contradicted everything the Salazar family stood for. She betrayed the duty that defined her marriage and her position. And it worked. Ramon survived. His illness stabilized. The terminal condition that should have killed him was arrested by the parasite integrating with his system. From Catalina's perspective, she'd saved her son's life. Whatever price she'd paid seemed worth it, but the price was higher than she could have imagined. The plaga didn't just cure Ramon's physical ailments. It altered something fundamental in his psychology. As he moved into adolescence, as the parasite fully integrated with his nervous system, his personality shifted. The child became cruel, sadistic, prone to violence that he seemed to enjoy. The incident with the servant calling him Pulgarcito, little thumbnail, demonstrates the transformation. Ramon was exceptionally short, his growth stunted by the illness the plaga had supposedly cured. When he overheard a servant using this nickname mockingly behind his back, a normal child might have been hurt or angry. Ramon invited the servant to his chambers, forced her to kneel, and poured vitriol on her face, melting her skin while smiling at her screams. The head housekeeper, a woman named Pasanta, who'd served the family for years, witnessed this act. She was horrified but powerless to intervene. Diego had given her a final commandment before his death: watch over Ramon, ensure he doesn't follow the path of wickedness. But how do you protect a child from himself? How do you guide someone who's no longer fully human, whose mind is partially controlled by a parasitic organism with its own agenda? Diego eventually learned what Catalina had done. We don't know exactly how. Perhaps he noticed the change in Ramon's personality. Perhaps he discovered evidence of Sadler's visits. Perhaps Catalina confessed. What we know is that the confrontation was violent and ended with Diego's murder. The family records state Diego was murdered at the hands of a devil. In the throne room of Salazar Castle, Leon Kennedy would later find Diego's portrait with a knife embedded in it, a knife that could be removed and taken, suggesting Ramon himself placed it there as a trophy or symbol. The portrait becomes a posthumous target, the father's image violated by the son he'd rejected. After Diego's death, Catalina disappeared. The records don't specify whether she fled, was killed, or removed herself from the situation deliberately. What matters is that she was gone, leaving Ramon as the sole surviving member of the Salazar bloodline. The eighth count of Valdalobos was an orphan teenager with a parasitic organism, granting him superhuman control over other infected hosts, a castle full of servants too afraid to challenge him, and no one left who remembered why the family's duty mattered more than personal power. Osmond Sadler had waited centuries for this opportunity. The Salazar family had been the primary obstacle to Los Iluminados' resurgence. Every generation of counts had maintained vigilance, kept the seals intact, prevented the cult from accessing Las Plagas. But now the current count was a traumatized child who'd been raised to see Los Iluminados as saviors rather than enemies. Sadler cultivated this perspective carefully. He visited Ramon regularly, taught him about the cult's beliefs, explained how the Salazar family had committed a terrible sin by suppressing Los Iluminados and sealing the holy parasites. He presented a worldview where Ramon's ancestors were villains and the cult were victims. The first Count Gregorio wasn't a hero who saved the region from demonic influence. He was a tyrant who destroyed a legitimate religion through violence and sealed away creatures that should be worshipped, not imprisoned. Ramon, isolated and angry at his father's rejection, found this narrative compelling. It transformed his family history from something noble into something shameful. It gave him a purpose, atone for his ancestors' sins by undoing what they'd done. The psychological manipulation was masterful. Sadler positioned himself as both healer and prophet, the man who'd saved Ramon's life and the spiritual leader offering redemption. Ramon's gratitude and guilt were weaponized against the very duty his family had maintained for centuries. When Ramon decided to unseal Las Plagas, he believed he was doing something righteous. The last count, Ramon's transformation. Ramon Salazar became the eighth count of Valdalobos somewhere in his mid-teens. Sources suggest he was 12 to 16 when he killed his father. He inherited the title, the castle, vast wealth, political authority, and a sacred duty he was about to deliberately violate. His first major decision as count was to officially lift the ban on Los Iluminados. Where his ancestors had suppressed the cult through force, Ramon welcomed them back openly. He granted Sadler access to the castle, to the sealed caverns, to the family records documenting where Las Plagas were concentrated and how the seals were constructed. The villagers of Valdalobos were uneasy. The first Count Gregorio had become a folk hero precisely because he'd driven out Los Iluminados and brought Catholic order to the region. Generations had grown up believing the cult represented evil, that the parasites were demons, that the Salazar family's primary virtue was keeping these forces contained. Now, their young lord was inviting the demons back, but what could they do? Ramon held absolute authority. He controlled the garrison, owned the land, had the backing of a cult that had spent centuries preserving knowledge of bioweapons and mind control. Opposition meant death, or worse, implantation with a parasite that would strip away free will and turn you into an extension of the prophet's consciousness. Ramon ordered an excavation of the sealed caverns. He recruited workers from the village, presented it as an archaeological project, offered good pay for dangerous work in the underground passages. The workers were told they'd be digging up artifacts, exploring historical ruins, documenting what the first count had sealed away. They weren't told about Las Plagas. The excavation began in the late 1990s. Workers descended into the ancient complex beneath the castle, discovered the vast underground city, found the Plaga remains preserved in amber and clustered throughout the caves. The organisms appeared to be fossilized, dead for centuries, no threat to anyone. But Las Plagas don't fossilize, they sporulate. The mummified remains the workers found weren't dead parasites. They were dormant organisms in spore form, waiting for the right conditions to regenerate. When the workers disturbed the clusters, when they broke open the amber, microscopic spores were released into the air. The workers inhaled them, carried them in their lungs back to the surface, went home to their families with parasites already beginning to regenerate in their bodies. Over the next several years, those spores rebuilt themselves. The workers began experiencing symptoms, painful seizures, behavioral changes, loss of autonomy. By the time they understood what was happening, it was too late. The parasites had integrated with their nervous systems, transformed them into ganados, the lost ones, human shells controlled by plaga organisms. Osman Sadler's research team, meanwhile, worked in laboratories Ramon had funded from the family treasury. They examined the surviving plaga remains, extracted fragmentary DNA, began cloning projects to create new generations of parasites. They developed eggs that could be implanted in hosts more efficiently than natural infection. They engineered dominant strains that would grant control over subordinate organisms. Ramon himself received one of these dominant plagas. He was already infected with the strain his mother had allowed years earlier, but Sadler upgraded him. The new parasite gave him expanded abilities. He could control other infected hosts, could command ganados with thought alone, could even implant parasites in others using tentacles that sprouted from his hands. The transformation was complete. Ramon Salazar wasn't just a count who sympathized with Los Iluminados. He was a full member of the cult, a high-ranking leader with his own forces, a guardian of the parasites his family had spent centuries trying to keep sealed. Sadler established operations throughout Valdelobos. The village church, once Catholic, was converted to Los Iluminados worship. The local priest was either killed or infected. Services now preached about the holy nature of Las Plagas, about the divine purpose of surrendering free will to the prophet's consciousness. The villagers attended these services because refusing meant attracting attention, and attention meant a plaga egg implanted in your neck. The castle became a fortress again, but this time designed to protect the cult rather than guard against it. The elaborate contraptions Diego the architect had built were repurposed. The hedge maze Ramon's ancestor had created was turned into a pen for colmillos, infected wolf dogs. The ballroom Alejandro the Lavish had built was overrun with novistadors, insects created by combining human and plaga DNA in experiments conducted beneath the castle. Ramon funded extensive research projects from the family wealth. He built laboratories, hired geneticists, provided resources for bioweapons development. His personal doctor, Isidro Uriarte Talavera, worked in facilities under the castle creating new organisms. The novistadors were Talavera's first success, human-sized insects with natural camouflage and the ability to reproduce rapidly. They quickly multiplied, filled the tunnels, eventually broke through to the ballroom level where they established a nest. Ramon also converted his loyal servants into verdugos, heavily mutated bodyguards engineered through painful experimentation. The head housekeeper Pasanta, who'd watched over him since childhood, was transformed into one of these creatures despite her horror at what he'd become. Her loyalty to the Salazar family remained even after her humanity was stripped away. By 2004, Valdalobos was completely under Los Iluminados' control. Every villager was infected. Every resident of the castle was converted. The region that once represented Catholic triumph over paganism had become a cult stronghold where human sacrifice resumed, where parasites were cultivated and distributed, where bioweapons research advanced without oversight, and Ramon, aged 20 but looking ancient due to the plague's effects on his body, ruled over all of it from his throne in the castle his ancestors had built to keep Los Iluminados out. Then Osman Sadler presented him with an opportunity that would cement the cult's power globally: the fall of House Salazar. The plan was audacious. Jack Krauser, working secretly for Albert Wesker, but presenting himself as a Los Iluminados ally, would kidnap Ashley Graham, daughter of the United States President. She'd be brought to Valdalobos, implanted with a plaga, and returned to her father. Once back in Washington, she'd infect the president and other high-ranking officials. Los Iluminados would achieve control over the U.S. executive branch and eventually the entire world. Ramon's role was to hold Ashley at the castle, complete her implantation ritual, and ensure she remained secure until Krauser delivered her to Sadler's Island facility. It should have been simple. The castle was a fortress. Ramon had hundreds of ganados, multiple bioweapons, elaborate defensive systems. One American girl couldn't possibly escape. Then Leon S. Kennedy arrived. The U.S. government agent was sent to rescue Ashley. He fought through the infected villagers, survived encounters with the village chief, Vitoris Mendez, eventually reached the church where Ashley was held. Leon killed Mendez, rescued Ashley, and headed for what he believed would be safety. Instead, they ended up at Salazar Castle. Ramon's first interaction with Leon was theatrical. He appeared on a balcony with his two Verdugo bodyguards, introduced himself as the eighth Castellan, and informed Leon that he only needed Ashley alive. The American agent could die. Ramon departed dramatically, confident his castle's defenses would eliminate the threat. He was wrong. Leon and Ashley moved through the castle with frustrating efficiency. The elaborate traps Ramon activated, rotating bridges, spiked ceilings, flooding rooms, all failed to kill them. The Ganado zealots Ramon commanded were defeated. The armaduras, suits of armor possessed by plagas, were destroyed. Even the Garadors, blind, mutated humanoids with extreme strength and Wolverine-like claws, couldn't stop Leon's progress. Ramon's responses grew increasingly desperate and petty. He hijacked Leon's radio communications, taunted him, tried to break his confidence with mockery. The exchanges became almost comical. Ramon's theatrical villainy meeting Leon's dry wit in radio conversations that couldn't have been more different in tone. "I've sent my right hand to dispose of you," Ramon declared at one point. "Your right hand comes off," Leon replied, because apparently even in life or death situations the agent couldn't resist a joke. But Ramon wasn't just posturing. He'd actually sent one of his verdugos to kill Leon in the castle's underground passages. The creature was nearly invulnerable, regenerating damage faster than Leon could inflict it. Only by freezing the verdugo with liquid nitrogen did Leon manage to make it vulnerable enough to defeat. When Leon survived that encounter and continued advancing, Ramon activated his final trap. He released the Novistadors from their nest, let them swarm through the castle. One of the insects grabbed Ashley during the chaos, carried her away while Leon fought the others. Ramon recaptured her, brought her to his throne room, and prepared to complete her implantation ritual. Leon arrived too late. Ramon triggered a trapdoor beneath the agent's feet, dropping him into the castle's lower levels. By the time Leon fought back to the throne room, Ashley had already been taken to the ceremony chamber where the Plaga implantation was completed. Ramon handed her over to Jack Krauser, who would deliver her to Sadler's Island. But Leon wasn't finished. He caught up to Ramon in a tower adjacent to the castle, the chamber where the Queen Plaga was housed. The queen was an enormous creature that reproduced Plaga organisms constantly, the source of new parasites for cult expansion. Ramon had been tasked with protecting it, facing defeat, facing the reality that he'd failed to stop Leon despite every advantage. Ramon made a final decision. He merged with the Queen Plaga, combining his own body with the massive organism and his remaining Verdugo bodyguard. The transformation was grotesque. Ramon's human form became a heart visible within the creature's flesh. The Verdugo's head extended on a long neck. Tentacles erupted from the walls. In the original version, this created a wall-mounted horror that Leon had to destroy section by section. In the remake, Ramon's fusion with the Queen Plaga produced a more mobile creature, a slug-like entity that traversed the chamber using tendrils, possessing a three-jawed mouth with Ramon's true form visible inside like a grotesque tongue. Either way, Leon killed it. He destroyed the merged creature, causing it to shrivel and die. Ramon's last words, in both versions, were crying out to Lord Sadler for help. The prophet didn't answer. Ramon died knowing he'd failed not just his family's duty, but also the cult he'd betrayed them for. The eighth Count of Valdalobos died at age 20, having ruled for perhaps 4 or 5 years. He'd lived longer than his illness should have allowed, but not long enough to see the consequences of his choices. He died believing Los Iluminados would triumph, that his actions had secured the cult's future. Within hours, Leon would reach Sadler's Island and kill the prophet himself, effectively destroying Los Iluminados as an organized force. The few surviving ganados would convulse in agony when the dominant plaga controlling them died. The cult that had existed for centuries would be scattered again, its leadership eliminated, its plans foiled, and the Salazar bloodline, which had maintained its duty for 8 generations spanning 300 years, ended in the body of a parasitized 20-year-old who'd chosen cult indoctrination over family legacy. Legacy and lessons. The story of the Salazar family is, at its core, a tragedy of duty and failure. For 7 generations, the family successfully maintained one of the most difficult responsibilities imaginable, guarding a supernatural threat that couldn't be destroyed, only contained. Each count understood the stakes, trained their heirs in the family's true purpose, made sacrifices to ensure the duty continued. Gregorio the Conqueror established the duty through violent conquest and strategic foresight. Hippolito the Sealer proved willing to die protecting what his father had accomplished. Gregorio the Architect spent the family fortune on defenses against threats others couldn't see. Jose Alonso the Tranquil rebuilt what his father had depleted. Alejandro the Lavish failed in his responsibility but died before it mattered. Maria Isabel the Lady corrected her husband's mistakes and maintained security for decades. Diego the Severe continued the vigilance even at the cost of his family's happiness. Then came Ramon. It's tempting to blame him entirely. He was the one who unsealed Las Plagas, who welcomed Los Iluminados back, who actively betrayed everything his family stood for. But that ignores the circumstances that made his fall possible. Ramon was dealt an impossible hand, born with a terminal illness to a father who saw weakness as shameful, and a mother desperate enough to make deals with the family's ancient enemies. Implanted with a parasite that saved his life but altered his psychology. Orphaned as a teenager through a combination of his mother's desperation and his own plaga-enhanced violence. Left alone in a castle full of servants too terrified to challenge him, with no mentor to explain why the duty mattered, with only Osmond Sadler providing guidance and purpose. Could Ramon have resisted Sadler's manipulation? Possibly, but that assumes he had the tools to recognize manipulation in the first place, that the plaga in his system wasn't influencing his thoughts more than he realized, that being an isolated, traumatized teenager with superhuman powers wouldn't make cult indoctrination easier. The real failure was systemic. The Salazar family's duty required passing knowledge from generation to generation, ensuring each heir understood not just what they were protecting, but why it mattered. When Diego died before properly educating Ramon, when Catalina disappeared, leaving no one to explain the family history, when the teenage count was left without guidance, the entire system collapsed. One generation's failure to prepare the next ended 3 centuries of success. This is why the story matters beyond just Resident Evil lore. The Salazar family represents institutions and traditions that depend on each generation understanding their importance. When the knowledge transfer breaks down, when duty becomes just empty ritual rather than understood purpose, when isolation and trauma override careful training, everything falls apart. Valdolobos, after Ramon's death, faced an uncertain future. Spanish authorities established a quarantine zone, forbidding travel in and out. The surviving villagers, those who hadn't been killed during Leon's assault, or died when Sadler's dominant plaga was destroyed, presumably lived with the aftermath of infection, the memory of what they'd done under parasitic control, the knowledge that their community had been turned into a nightmare. Salazar Castle stands empty now, a monument to a family that guarded humanity from supernatural horror for 300 years, before producing a final heir who opened the gates to exactly what his ancestors had fought to contain. The elaborate defenses Gregorio the architect built remain. The ballroom Alejandro the lavish commissioned still echoes. The throne where Ramon Salazar sat and believed he was serving a divine purpose collects dust. And beneath it all, in the sealed caverns, any surviving Las Plagas wait in spore form for the next person desperate or foolish enough to disturb them. The Valley of Wolves remembers. The stone holds history. And somewhere in those mountains, the ruins of an ancient civilization remind us that some threats aren't meant to be awakened. Some duties exist for good reasons, and some families carry burdens that should never be abandoned. The Salazar family understood this for 8 generations. They maintained their vigil, paid the price, fulfilled the duty. That their legacy ended in betrayal and horror doesn't erase the centuries of successful guardianship that preceded it. They were heroes right up until they weren't. They protected the world right up until they unleashed exactly what they'd been protecting it from. And now their castle stands empty, their bloodline extinct, their duty unfulfilled, a warning to anyone who thinks tradition and vigilance don't matter. That one generation can abandon what 10 generations built, that the past isn't really that important. The Salazars proved otherwise. They proved it through success and through failure. They proved that some duties transcend individual lives and personal desires. They proved that what we guard today protects everyone tomorrow. And they proved, in the end, that even the strongest traditions can fall when just one heir decides that maybe their ancestors were wrong after all. Rest now in the Valley of Wolves, where the castle watches over sealed caverns and empty halls. Remember nobles who kept faith with a promise made 3 centuries ago. Sleep knowing that duty matters, that vigilance serves purpose, that some families carry burdens specifically so others don't have to. The Salazar line has ended. The parasites are scattered. The cult is broken. But the stone remembers. The caves remember. The earth remembers what walked upon it and what sleeps beneath. And in the silence of those mountain passages, in the darkness under the castle, Las Plagas wait in spore form for the next person who thinks themselves clever enough, desperate enough, or righteous enough to disturb what should remain sealed forever. The Salazars learned this lesson 8 times. The last count forgot it once. Once was enough.